to, I invite you to enter into the chat where you're Zooming from, and what does freedom look, feel, or sound like to you. My name is Karen Buenavista Hanna. I am right now in the land of Timucuan people, otherwise known as Flagler Beach, Florida. Super excited to be here alongside folks that we've been convening with and planning this, experiment of a freedom school, continuation of last summer's Twitter space that many of us were a part of. So yeah, this is all an experiment. Really excited to continue to just plan events and convergent spaces, as Christina Heatherton would say, convergent spaces to talk about radical history, talk about radical futures and what that would look like. So again, those of you who are joining us, if you could just put into the chat if you feel comfortable, where you're Zooming from, and what does freedom look or sound or feel like to you, just like one word when you think of freedom, right? And yep, if you have not subscribed to the newsletter yet, feel free to, the link is in the chat. I am so honored to be here with Manijeh Moradian, who wrote this amazing, amazing book, This Flame Within, about the Iranian left in the US. When I first met Manijeh, I was really blown away about the parallels and convergences that I learned about. So parallels of feminist revolutionaries that were organizing at the same time in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, doing really similar work, anti-dictatorship work, anti-Shah work, holding a really similar kind of vision of the world, doing similar organizing. So like a lot of similarities while also actually organizing together. And this was history that I had not previously known about, and was really excited to learn that Manijeh was working on her book so I could learn more about it, and so that she could share it with the world and show that all the radical work that these revolutionaries were doing was, there's sometimes we can frame it, we can think about it as like, oh, it's just, nationalism. It's just very narrow, thinking about different ethnic communities or national communities. But the radical people that Manijeh writes about and that I study, and so many people on this this group here organizing the Freedom School are concerned with, are, we've been learning about, and we know about these relational aspirations and processes that those organizers and activists undertook and engaged in. So I want to introduce Manijeh Moradian, who is an assistant professor at Barnard College, and she has been so lovely and generous to share her time with us today to share about the Iranian Student Association and give us a little snapshot about the important theoretical concepts that she outlines about internationalism and using her feminist analytic to really change the way that we can think about social movements. So thank you, Manijeh, for coming. I guess let's just start off by inviting you to talk a little bit about the ISA, the Iranian Student Association. Can you tell us about it? And who are they? What do they do? And we can go from there.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Karen, for that introduction. And thanks to all the organizers for doing this amazing work and inviting me here. It's an honor to get to share what I've been thinking about with all of you and hear what you've been thinking about. And I just have to say that when I first met Karen, it was like this incredible experience of finding, a kindred spirit and a feminist comrade. We were both trying to do similar projects of, honoring the movements and struggles of our people who've come before us, but also kind of offer like loving forms of critique, right? So not just celebrating the past in a kind of nostalgic way, like, oh wow, back in the 60s and 70s, there was all this third world internationalism and it was so great back then, kind of not doing it that way, like, honoring, respecting, learning from, but also engaging with some of the problems, the shortcomings, the limitations of the forms of Marxist revolutionary politics that were dominant at the time, and trying to pay attention to, what history has taught us since then, and the ways that I think revolutionary forms of feminism have made key interventions that have helped our Marxism, our anti-imperialism become even more ethical, even more concerned with freedom in a kind of very capacious form that's not just about national sovereignty. Like, yes, that's really important. But the case of Iran really teaches us that, national sovereignty does not always or often equal freedom, liberation, justice, and the things we're really fighting for. So with that, I'm going to rewind and tell you about the Iranian Students Association. So I'm taking you back to a different geopolitical era when Iran and the US were allies. We're so used to, we probably all grown up predominantly in the era where the US and Iran are like arch enemies, existential threats, really arrayed against each other on the global stage. But of course, that wasn't always the case. The Shah, or King of Iran, was a major US ally, for decades during the 20th century. And so I look at that era before the Iranian Revolution that kicked the US out and is the period we were most familiar with. So the Iranian Students Association was made up of students coming from Iran on student visas to the United States in order to get a Western education and then go back home and kind of build Iranian capitalism according to Western development models. So they were kind of like the sort of indigenous bourgeoisie, if you will, right? Like they were supposed to get a Western education, get the technocratic skills, but also the ideological worldview that would help them go back home and build Iran in kind of to serve US interests, right? In a kind of neo-colonial vein. But what I found, what happened was that a minority of the foreign students who came to the United States, they really couldn't go along with that project. They had, for a complex variety of reasons, already carried with them from Iran to the US an embodied knowledge of the hypocrisies and contradictions of what US-backed modernization and development really meant in Iran. And that was, of course, support for dictatorship, censorship, a massive surveillance apparatus, political prisoners, torture, all of that, right? And so they brought that embodied knowledge with them and found that they had a lot in common with many other foreign students from other US-backed dictatorships who were also here to get that Western education and go back home and help run the neo-colony, right? And furthermore, they also found they had a lot in common with Americans from different racial backgrounds who were resisting unjust US power right here at home. So it was a kind of historical conjuncture, right, where these domestic movements against racism and poverty, especially led by African Americans, were learning from anti-colonial movements around the world. And then you have the actual people, foreign students, showing up from those colonial contexts or neo-colonial contexts in the case of Iran, bringing with them sort of firsthand accounts of, in the case of Iran, the CIA coup in 1953, the persecution of communism, and like I said, an entire apparatus of censorship, surveillance, and state repression. So people were comparing notes. They were meeting on their campuses, in their dorms. Usually a lot of campuses had like an international house where a lot of foreign students lived. And so it was this really incredible moment of like diasporas converging, right? And I think that when we think about the radicalism of US movements, Black Power and, anti-war movements and things in the 60s and 70s, or the radical movements for ethnic studies, we often forget the role of a kind of anti-colonial global perspective. And the fact that a lot of those domestic anti-racist movements were deeply influenced by anti-colonial struggles and had themselves an internationalist, anti-imperialist politics. They weren't just fighting for more rights and inclusion within the United States. They really saw themselves as part of a global revolutionary upsurge of young people that was trying to change the world. So the Iranian Students Association became the vehicle through which those radicalized Iranian students joined that movement. They helped to educate folks around them who didn't know the history of US involvement and intervention in Iran, and they compared notes and learned about other people's struggles. And and they found many points of convergence. And so maybe, should I share some of these images from my archive? I guess I should say that for the book, I did a combination of a bunch of archival research, looking at movement, periodicals, flyers, posters, things like that. And I interviewed over 30 Iranians who had been activists in the ISA, Iranian Students Association. So I'll just show a few slides. If I can do this. And I'll just move this. Sorry, I'm just going to play from the current slide. So this is actually one key point of convergence, of course, was, let's hope it shows up. Can you guys see it? I'm sort of waiting for it to.
Yes.
Okay, there we go. Was political prisoners. One of the main activities that the ISA engaged in was campaigning to free political prisoners in Iran and to expose the fact that the US-backed Shah was not an enlightened monarch bringing modernity and lifting all boats through economic development, but in fact was really a tyrant persecuting all dissent. And of course, they were against all of the US-backed dictatorships, right? They understood that Iran was not alone. And they really understood that Iran was part of Asia, quite frankly. It's Western Asia, but they understood that there was, that the US was waging its Cold War in Asia through a variety of, military interventions, coups d'etats, support for dictatorships, through a variety of methods and techniques. And they wanted to put those in conversation. And so they organized with the Union of Vietnamese Students in the United States and with the KDP, the Union of Democratic Filipinos, around issues of dictatorship, political prisoners, and exposing the systematic use of torture by US funded and backed governments across.
Manisha.
Yes.
We actually can only see, we see like your notes, you're like we see two slides. So if you were able to like zoom in, I think that would be. We can see it, but it's just small.
Oh, that's so weird. That's not how it looks for me. I'm so sorry. Okay, I'm trying to exit the share screen, but it's not letting me do that. Let's see. Escape. I wonder why that's happening. Because for me, it's just a big image.
You could show it again, maybe, and then if you could read it out loud. I mean, I have it in front of me in my book, and I feel like if we could just read it, it would even be awesome.
Yeah. Okay. Tell me if this image looks any different, though. Oh wait, sorry. That's the. Okay. Can you see one image at a time now?
Now we don't see anything. We don't see your slides at all.
So weird. Okay. Oh dear. I have no idea why that's happening. I'm so sorry. Let me see if I can find you all again. Am I not in the screen share anymore? Oh, it went out of screen share. I'm so sorry. Okay, let me try one more time. Okay, can you see this one slide?
Yes. So that's the resistance slide.
Yeah, so, all right, I'm gonna try to just,
Yeah, perfect. And then so,
if I play from current slide, maybe it's when I try to play it as a slideshow, it doesn't work. I don't know, let's see.
yeah, I think that's it. I
Ah,
think it's better when you just showed
you can't see that.
the other screen. Yeah, it's
Sorry.
showing kind of the behind the scenes.
Oh, it's so weird. I'm so sorry. I have no idea why. Okay.
Yeah, we
Oh,
can see it really clear. Well, at least I could see it really clearly when it's like that.
what about if I do, no, this? Sorry. Can you see that?
No, it's smaller.
Oh no.
Yeah, no, it's great. The
It's
one that you
totally
had
not
before
working.
this.
All right.
It,
So
it honestly,
sorry.
it's perfect when you put it back to the previous.
Okay.
Yeah, right here.
Okay, so it says a question of political prisoners, and this is a flyer for a forum at UC Berkeley in the student union. So it says forum program, and they had speakers. They had someone named Franz Sherman on U.S. involvement in third world countries. Perhaps that was a professor, I'm not sure. They had speakers from Iran, the Philippines, and South Vietnam, which of course South Vietnam was where the US had its puppet regime fighting the war. They had skits and songs. They showed a film called South Vietnam, A Question of Torture. And the sponsoring organizations are at the bottom, including the KDP. And when I interviewed people, Iranians who'd been active in the movement, they really talked passionately about like their commitments to the liberation struggles of others, including in the Philippines. They were friends with Filipinx, they didn't say Filipinx at the time, but, with activists, leftists from the Philippines. And they were kind of part of the same like social circles and political milieu. So they were really doing joint organizing, and they really understood that US imperialism in the Philippines and in Iran had a lot in common because of the support for dictatorship. So that was one of the common linkages that people were organizing around. This is another flyer the ISA organized with SDS, Students for Democratic Society, and they were really part of the left wing of the movement against the Vietnam War. So they were arguing against some of the more liberal demands for moratorium. They wanted the war to end, and they also wanted the Vietnamese to win. So they had a very clear anti-imperialist position. This is a flyer from another anti-war demonstration in San Francisco, and you can see the signs around Vietnam mixed with signs about Iran, and then in the back there's an Arab students sign. So what I was really trying to capture, this is about Palestine and really situating Iran as part of a regional imperial project and a regional solidarities of resistance, thinking about Iran and Palestine together, because of course the Shah and Israel were the two outposts of US interests in the region, and the Shah's support for Israel was really key. So Iranians and Palestinians were very close and organized together. And so I wanted to show that there really was this spirit of internationalism that wasn't abstract. It was something embodied and felt. And so I work with ideas about affect and emotion, affect being the way that the body registers coming into contact with the world. And affect kind of describes these inchoate and indeterminate kinds of visceral energies that we don't even yet know what form they'll take ideologically or politically, but they provide a kind of reservoir, an affective reservoir where the body registers injustice, unfairness. And that affect, I argue, gets mobilized by political organizations and ideas, right, in certain times and places. So, you have folks coming from the Philippines, folks coming from Iran, folks coming from the Caribbean, from different parts of Africa, and talking to each other about their experiences in their home countries, about the role of the US in their home countries, and gravitating towards similar forms of Marxism-Leninism, Maoism, anti-colonial forms of Marxism that were also gaining traction among people of color in the United States. So I found the presence of Iranians supporting Black liberation movement. This is a poster made by one ISA member in New York City, of course, with Bobby Seale, co-founder of the Black Panther Party, and Angela Davis, who were both political prisoners at the time. So that was the connection, right? It's like the US also has political prisoners, right? And so we want to be in solidarity with the struggles for freedom here and there. So that was important to me too, to point out that Iranians weren't only concerned with Iran, right? They also wanted to, they understood that if the Vietnamese won, it was a victory for all oppressed people, right? Or to get Bobby and Angela out of prison was a blow against the same imperialist power that was imprisoning folks in Iran, right? Like that's the way that they understood the connections. It was visceral, but it was also very clear because all roads kind of led back to the United States, right? And I'll just show one more picture. This shows you a little bit of the kind of iconography of the way that women revolutionaries were imagined as part of this global third world internationalism, right? So you can see these images here of women as political prisoners, but also as liberation fighters, as heroes, as brave, as taking their place in the struggle and working for liberation, just as much as any man, right? So this is kind of the way that the ideas about women's liberation showed up, right? The idea was that women would liberate themselves through participation in the anti-imperialist revolution. So I'm going to stop the share. And so, Karen, of course, I can go on and begin to make my critiques of some of this, but should I pause now? Because I would love for you to get to talk about, that period of history, maybe in your own work. And
yeah, that was a really fantastic, Manijay. And just for, for the folks who are here, I want to emphasize that, we're doing things a little bit differently in this, in the way we structured the Freedom School today, in the fact that we're zooming outward, right? We're usually, we can be kind of narrow in the way that we are studying history as being sort of very like ethno-nationalist and focused on the one singular identity, ethnic identity or racial identity of a group. But what we're doing is zooming outward and starting with somebody that Filipinos were in solidarity with and continue to be in solidarity with, and learning about that struggle and seeing that those struggles were interconnected in this really material way that Manijay is talking about. So I really appreciate you showing us, especially those posters, Manijay, because I feel like, in my study of the Filipinx American left during that time period, often what's discussed is Latin America and Palestine. And Michael's article was optionally assigned for this summer school. Does an incredible job. I love the article so much, and he and Joy are going to be going into more detail about it in session 2. But what's not highlighted, what I haven't seen, is Iran in as much of the literature. I mean, if at all. And so that's what you do, is you provide this entry point just in that one poster to show that Filipino people in the radical group, the KDP, were organizing this event together with the Iranian students in California at Berkeley. And it's just one little taste of that work that they were doing together. So thank you so much for that. Yeah, I know you could talk so much more and about it, but I would love to be able to share a little bit about the KDP, because I don't know if folks here are as know a lot about it. Can you raise your hands if raise your hand if you've heard about the KDP? This was the most militant Filipino radical organization in this in the 70s, founded in 1973. So a handful of you. So I'm going to share my screen and just show you this one slide. And I could go on and on and on and on as well. But just a little bit about it. And again, Michael and Joy are going to be talking about the KDP's later years in their work with the Committee for Justice for Domingo and Fairness. But this was the preceding years. KDP was the organization that that kind of was the feeder organization to the line of march that the committee was part of. And they did very rich organizing, similar to the ISA. They're young people, right? There were folks who were in their late teens, early 20s into their 30s, and then continued organizing, for decades, and many of them are still organizing today. But they started in their youth, and we're doing like very sophisticated type of organizing, very, very organized. So from 1973 to 86, the KDP, which was the acronym for Katipunan ng mga Demokratikong Pilipino, which means the Union for Democratic Filipinos. They built 9 chapters in cities across the US, from Seattle to New York to Guam to Chicago. And they also had an arm in Canada, which was another formation that did solidarity work with the movement in the Philippines, as well as doing their domestic anti-racist work here. And they did leadership. They had leadership consisting of a 9-member national council and executive board based in the Bay Area, as well as regional and chapter executive boards in various cities. So again, very, very highly organized, a very, very highly organized organization that had a national body as well as North American formation. So like the ISA, it was local, transnational, and again, radical, right? It was anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, and they call it the dual line. It had 2 goals. One was to fight for socialism in the US, right? Understanding that anti-racism was part of building socialism and an alternative class system that raised up and fought for the rights of working people, right? And then 2 was to support the revolutionary movement in the Philippines, which was working to establish national sovereignty for the Filipino people, as well as to working to oust the dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr. from power. So the father of Bongbong Marcos, who's in power now. So even that, if that's new information to you, or you've heard a little bit about Bongbong Marcos and the revisionism happening today, right? This is part, you can't understand the significance of Bongbong Marcos being in the position of power that he's in today without understanding the legacy that his family carries and his presidency symbolizes in the minds of people who were, tortured, political prisoners, tortured, murdered, family members murdered, right, in the Philippines during his father's dictatorship, alongside the immense corruption, which could be, we could talk about at length as well, right? So the KDP, right, took that Philippine national sovereignty and ousting Philippine dictator Marcos under their took that under their or took that on, right? And then also had this fight for socialism. So fought for bilingual education in schools, labor reform, for various workers groups, from medical professionals to working class cannery workers in Seattle and Alaska. And they also worked for housing rights as well, among their many, many, many other things. You may have heard of the International Hotel, and so the KDP was a leader organization that took that on. And so that's the first picture there that you see on the slide, is the I Hotel, and the banners around that. So they had a newspaper, so that's a third picture on that slide, and a record album. They had this cultural groups or a cultural group called Sining Bayan, which was also very prolific in weaving cultural work. They saw cultural work as being really important to the street protest work, the lobbying work that they did in DC. Yeah, there's so much more that I could say, but what we really, again, want to tease out here is both the internationalist dimensions of these groups, that they were so, not just similar again, but convergent, right? They worked together. They saw each other's struggles as part of the same struggle, right? The overarching struggle that was global. And then we also see the feminist dimensions that were strands that we can tease out of both organizations, right? The preliminary thinking around leadership, around what equity looks like. The KDP, I think, operated a little bit differently in terms of the way that they were thinking about feminism at the time. They weren't so kind of overt in terms of thinking of themselves as feminists, but one way that we can kind of use a feminist analytic to think about what they did that was cutting edge and feminist at the time, even though they weren't using the language of that, was that they had many of their leaders were women, and many of their leaders were gay or lesbian or bisexual, and they were the only the only organization in the Asian American left that had out members, where you could be out and not be politically, alienated from your organization. So yeah, I think that's what I wanted to share about about the KDP. And I think
were they out in the 70s?
Yeah, they were out in the 70s.
Amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm going off the script here, Manuje. So in the ISA, what are you able to recover any?
Yeah, no, I mean, I asked and asked, nobody was out, and nobody would talk about any kind of same-sex anything. In fact, the Iranian left was really not participating in like the sexual revolution. They saw that as like bourgeois decadence, and they wanted to be quote unquote serious revolutionaries. And so they were actually quite like strict. And I mean, people would sort of on the down low do whatever, but like you were not supposed to be distracted by, these kind of carnal desires. All of your desires should be for the revolution. It was quite in that mode, at least ideologically. And I mean, the ISA members did not use the word feminism, just to be clear. It had been co-opted by the Shah. The Shah had started like a state-run women's organization of Iran. And that was really damaging, because what it did was it associated feminism with a US-backed dictatorship. It associated feminism with imperialism. And so part of the difficult situation that put Iranian women in a very difficult situation, especially during the popular revolution of 1979 that did overthrow the Shah, when Iranian women rose up and said, and we want equal and full rights in this post-Shah society, they were attacked by leftists, liberals, nationalists, Islamists. Basically, all the anti-imperialist coalition turned against them and said, you're helping the imperialists, you're bourgeois, you're westernized, and just totally discredited them and drove them off the streets. And Iranian women have been legally second-class citizens with legal forms of gender apartheid and discrimination for 43 years. So that's some of the contradictions that I was trying to look at, is how did it happen that the left, which is supposed to be fighting for liberation, and would repeat Mao's slogan of women hold up half the sky, and did have gender quotas for leadership and did try to include women in all aspects of their movement, how is it that they ended up kind of uniting with conservative Islamists against women's demands for basic rights, equality and autonomy, the right to decide what you wear and have, your testimony count the same as a man's in court, or, custody to your children, whatever, basic things, right? And so I did really end up looking very critically at the ways in which women were incorporated into the idea of revolutionary struggle. And I talked to a lot of women who were part of it, and it was a very ambivalent thing, because on the one hand, it was really empowering to join a revolutionary movement and organization and to dedicate your life to that struggle and to feel like, wow, people will listen to me and respect me and not just think of me as a sex object, or like whether or not I'm going to be a good wife, right, and have lots of children for them, right? It was a way out of that patriarchal set of expectations. At the same time, it was also a way into a new set of norms and expectations, right, in which women were supposed to sacrifice themselves and subordinate everything to the revolution, to the struggle. And any attempt to assert something that might seem like feminism was considered divisive, separatism. And what was important to me was to say that like these debates were playing out across the left. And so I kind of want to like hunt the ball back to you, Karen, to talk about what these debates look like in the Filipino left, because I know these debates were playing out in the Black Panther Party. What is the role of women? Is it to serve the organization and the movement, or do women get to actually have liberation too? Do we have to first overthrow capitalism and then we can talk about gender and sexual equality? Do we have to first overthrow imperialism and then we can talk about the role of women? Or is the fight for gender and sexual liberation simultaneous with the fight against capitalism and empire, right? Like, so I ended up being very critical of what I call a hierarchical model of anti-imperialism that kind of ranked oppressions and really assumed, wrongly, as we know now from history, that if you kicked out the Shah and got rid of the US neo-colonial apparatus, you would have, liberation. But instead, we saw the consolidation of a new form of patriarchal authoritarianism that was not backed by the US, but that was nonetheless very repressive. And so that question of how women's liberation figures into the anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist revolution is one that every movement has had to contend with. And I think things went very badly in Iran. And part of why we see a current uprising right now, which we don't have time to talk about, but right now in Iran, there is actually a feminist revolution underway. It's very much trying to, sort of pick up the pieces of what was lost in 1979 and continue that movement. But Karen, do you want to talk about how these debates played out in the movements that you study?
Yeah, I'd love to. Actually, there's so much there in what you said. I think one first thing is that I want to add some nuance to the, the leaders of the KDP. Many of them were gay, lesbian, bisexual. They were, and yet they also were navigating exactly what you were talking about, the bourgeois, like homosexuality being considered a bourgeois decadence. That was something that was, internalized and by many of the members, even if they identified as gay, lesbian, or bisexual, or they were navigating that in the way that they related to other organizations, right? It was like kind of like a don't ask, don't tell kind of way of being. You could. It didn't matter what you were, who you were sleeping with, right? And so that was in a way progressive, right? But you still had to be doing your work. And so in that way, there was still a separation between kind of like you can do what you want as long as you keep it private, but we're not incorporating it into our analysis of revolution. And so it wasn't until the AIDS crisis in the 80s that line of march, which the KDP kind of ended up transitioning into, which was a multiracial US left formation, that those kind of theories emerged. But that wasn't until the 80s. So yeah, I mean, they were still kind of contending with the same things that you were talking about in terms of the Iranian left, for sure. But then as far as the woman question and the gender and sexual, or the gender contradictions, those also were very fraught, continue to be fraught within not just the Philippine left, but the women's movement within the Philippine left. I think similar to what you were saying about, women being berated, being traitors, being kind of Western traitors. I mean, horrible, things were said to women who were really questioning the way of thinking about women's empowerment, women's rights, as where women were, there were women who were thinking about the woman question differently, where they were saying, okay, women hold up half the sky, but we can't wait until the revolution to do something about gender equity. I think what you're talking about in Iran is actually is a cautionary tale when I hear it, because what happened in the Philippines in '86 when Marcos was ousted was that you sort of see an NGOization, which is what many people will refer to as the co-optation of the women's movement, which was going through its own kind of exciting moments of possibility. And that's something that you write about in your book in terms of an analytic that we can learn from, this methodology of possibility, right? Like there's this lost opportunity in which there was a questioning of the limits of a framework in which women on the front lines of the movement was equated to gender equity, right? There were women who were questioning that, saying that that's not enough, that we are productive in the movement, right? We need to question women being on the front lines joining the front lines, joining that, as producers. We need to question that and see that, there's all this domestic work that's happening behind the scenes that isn't questioned, right? The women activists who were, making the coffee for the men who were considered the leaders and considered the theoreticians, right? Women were making theories and they were not being recognized for the work that they were doing intellectually, as well as the work that they were doing to keep families running, to keep organizations running, right? They were doing so many things that weren't being honored. And so just because they were fighting in the guerrilla army didn't mean that equity was happening, right? It was a start, like what you were saying, Manijay, but it wasn't the end all be all, and it couldn't be the end all be all. So I appreciate learning about the Iranian left and the way in which we see that even when the revolution was won, in a way, right, that the Shah was ousted, that because the question of gender wasn't taking it up seriously and in conversation with women, right, that we can't see that as the revolution being won, right? So I think there's so much more to talk about. We're kind of just laying down the seeds here for folks to be thinking about freedom, Filipinx freedom, as something that's not just narrowly for Filipinos, but need to be thought of on a broader sense. Or that's what I would hope for in the way that I think about freedom. So that, yeah, we're a little bit, I know we wanted to go to 3:45. We went a little bit over. There's a cushion time for folks to be able to take a break if you wish. And I know Manijay has to, speaking of behind the scenes, childcare, right? That if you need to run.
Can I add one last comment, just coming off of what you said? And I do wish we had more time, because I feel like listening to you talk, Karen, too, it's it just reminds me of these the KDP or the ISA and associated Iranian leftist Marxist groups of that era, like they are part of our inheritance and our genealogy, that like it's the participation of women in those revolutionary struggles on unequal terms that produces third world feminism as a response, right? Which actually is a major advance in our revolutionary theory and practice. If those women hadn't been taking up arms and hadn't been going underground and hadn't been participating in the movement, they wouldn't have realized that actually women's liberation can't be secondary or postponed until some future date. It has to be central to how we imagine the meaning of freedom and to our practices about how to get there, right? So it's a corrective. It's not just a negative experience. It's like a theoretical and political advance, right? That wouldn't have happened otherwise if those women weren't involved and weren't in some ways, betrayed or sidelined or and so out of that comes actually this really important, development of third world feminism, anti-colonial, post-colonial, transnational we have lots of word, decolonial, all these great, ways that feminism is taken away from a kind of bourgeois liberal Western, model, just like Marxism had to be, right? And is adapted to engage with the realities of racialized and colonized women. And I think that's, that's the sort of like arc of a kind of like genealogy that I'm trying to trace by going back and looking at this history and thinking about how can it help us in our movements today.
That's right. Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Manijay. The emergence of third world feminism happened alongside that. I mean, these women were the leaders of that, the women that we study.
Yeah.
So, if folks want to take a break, they're welcome to, but if there's folks who want to stay on and ask any questions or share any ideas that are coming to mind, now would be a good time as we wrap up this session.
I had a quick question about I think obviously what you all were just talking about um was so generative, but I wanted to, there was something in the reading that I wanted to ask about, just a little bit about the kind of militancy that you saw that emerged out of the kind of sorrow, right? The loss and grieving. And in both of your works, because you do both of your work deals with people who are kind of also looking back at a certain moment, right? It's not just the people at the time during the movement dealing with actual loss, dealing with actual like imprisonment, things like that, but also looking back several decades, and the kind of solidarities that emerges out of that, just surviving, I guess. Yeah, there's a lot to think about. I was just curious if you could talk a little bit more about the kind of affective solidarities that come out of, I guess you call it melancholia or a kind of mourning.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I don't know how many people read the chapter. It's totally fine if you didn't, but I was trying to talk about how, sorry, can you close that? Sorry, a lot of background noise all of a sudden. I was trying to understand, why it was that Iranian radical students got involved in all these other struggles that were not directly about Iran and all these other liberation movements. And so I talk about it as an affects of solidarity. So again, I don't want to just take for granted, like, oh, back in the day, third world internationalism was just cool or something. It just sort of happened. It's like, well, why did it happen? How did it happen? How was it lived and embodied and experienced in the everyday? And part of it was that people shared an ideology of like Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. These ideas were circulating. But again, why do people gravitate towards certain ideas over others? And why do they decide sometimes to reorient their entire lives around those ideas, to become revolutionaries, in the sense that you're willing to give up your whole future, your studies, your career, maybe even your life, for this project? I don't think we can explain that just by like, oh, I read this book and I liked it. It's like, it's something much deeper than that. And so I talk about this, how, I talk about it in terms of an affects of solidarity, that when different colonized or neo-colonized groups of people experience the injustice of having sovereignty taken away, of having rights and freedoms taken away, it leaves you with something. And you can spend your whole life trying to figure out what that something is, how to talk about it, and what to do about it. But when you meet other people who feel the same way, it can help you figure out what it means and what to do. And that's really what happened in this kind of diasporic location of the United States that I was describing before, when all these different groups of people were coming together and comparing notes. And so the thing that drew ISA members to certain demonstrations, to say solidarity with the Black Panthers, it was that affective response in the face of injustice to take a militant stance. So ISA members were not drawn to pacifist movements or more liberal forms of civil rights or other kind of more liberal forms of, say, democratic rights. They were drawn to the militants, and I think that's also what they had in common with the folks from the Philippines, right? The communists from the Philippines, is this kind of desire to just take a militant stance in the face of injustice. And that meant that you recognized when other people were doing that too. And when other people were doing that too, you wanted to stand with them because it resonated with your own feelings, your own desires and affects. And so that affects of solidarity, for me, describes how third world internationalism, was lived and experienced, and kind of the feeling that sustained it. Why'd you get up out of bed and skip class and go to a demonstration that had nothing to do with Iran, that was about Vietnam? Why did you go do that when you could get arrested, deported, and tortured back home? So you're risking something. What compels you to do that? So that's why I try to think about affect and emotion as a response to these embodied experiences of dictatorship. So thank you for that question, Alan.
And I think that one thing that is beautiful that I read in Manijay's book, and I see in the KDP and other Philippine leftists in the Philippines and in the United States and North America, that they have continued that their anti-imperialist work in different forms, right? And that's that they carry, and it's because of that affective tie to revolution, right? And so that's what's, I think, really productive about this idea of this methodology of possibility that Manijay writes or theorizes. It helps us to think about the afterlives of these movements that, if we were to just look at the Iranian left, right, the anti-Shah movement, and then the way that what's happening now, and say, oh, that movement failed, right? That we would lose a lot of what is actually happening, which is new forms of revolutionary thinking and created collectives. Like Manijay is part of a collective that just was formed in September, right? There's the Gina Collective, Manijay?
Yeah, it's called Feminist for Gina. I can put it in the chat, and it's basically trying to bring a kind of like intersectional, anti-capitalist, transnational feminist politics into our thinking about Iran, so that we don't just think about it as like the US versus the Islamic Republic, so we actually have like a different perspective. And
right.
I'll put the website. They're on Instagram too, of course, but I'll put the website in the chat. Yeah.
Right. And then, so, even just having Manijay here and learning about what's happening in Iran and being linked into this network, I think hopefully is planting a seed of continued solidarity that is nothing new, but picks up on what the solidarities that were forged in the 60s. Well, that was, it's 4 o'clock. So I think we're going to transition to session 2. So thank you again, Dr. Muradian Manijay, for being here and sharing your work and helping us to expand our thinking beyond the Filipino left and in really productive ways. It's just such a pleasure and honor to have you be with us.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hannah, and I can't wait for your book because you have so much to teach me and all of us. And I'm always telling Iranians we have to learn from the Filipinos and find out, their history and context too, because we're too isolated and siloed as well. So really appreciate this chance to be in conversation with all of you. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your time together. Bye, everyone.